Hi there! Welcome to probably the lamest Halloween special you'll ever see. I'm going to be providing a dramatic read-through of a thing I wrote. Well, I use the term wrote very loosely. It's Sonic.EXE, but it's well written and makes sense. So, like, 95% credit to the original author. If you don't know what Sonic.EXE is supposed to look like in its original form, consider yourself lucky. However, I'm sure you can very easily Google it and you'll be able to read it. Now, I'd be more concerned about the original author taking offense to this, but two things. A, he will probably never find this video. And B, I'd like to think that he's matured since he wrote the story. It is well known by now that for some time, Sonic.exe was considered a troll pasta, and the author, let's say, did not take it very well. But he's got to have matured by now, right? And if nothing else, he must be capable of writing better stories by now. And without further ado, time for the dramatic read-through / glorified slideshow of Sonic.exe, but it's well written and makes sense. And don't worry, there won't be cheap jump scares in this video. I'm way above that. This is either going to be kind of fun or the dumbest thing I've done in years. I've enjoyed the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise for the vast majority of my life by now. After all, the original Sonic game on the Genesis was the 4th game I ever played, and I do enjoy most of the modern Sonic games as well, despite all their flaws and faux pas. While I'm not personally too big on ROM hacks, I'm always interested and appreciative of the efforts other people go to make something interesting out of an already good product. And then there was Sonic.exe. One day this past summer, while enjoying Sonic Unleashed, I heard the mail get delivered. Most of it was just the typical annoying advertisements on organizations asking for donations, but one of them was a CD with Sonic.exe written on its otherwise blank surface. It wasn't even in any packaging, it was just a CD case. On the back of the case was a note. Tom, I can't take it anymore. I had to get rid of this thing somehow, before it was too late, and I was hoping you'd do it for me. I can't do it! He's after me! And if you don't destroy the CD, he'll come after you too! He's too fast for me! Please, destroy this godforsaken disc before he comes after you too! Destroy the disc, and he'll destroy him too! It's too late for me! Kyle. My friend Kyle? It occurred to me at that point that I hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks or so, but I had just figured he was on vacation. I was, of course, confused by this note, and at first wasn't even sure it was from the same Kyle I knew, but I could just barely recognize his handwriting. It was a bit sloppier than his normal writing, as if he was writing it in a hurry. While this, of course, struck me as odd, I came up with a logical explanation of what this was. Now, I'd never known Kyle as a programmer or hacker, but perhaps he wanted to make this bizarre Sonic hack and surprise me with it. Perhaps the messy handwriting was all done by design, to make it more enticing, and to emphasize the strangeness of the hack. Or perhaps he wrote the note late at night after he'd done most of the programming, and that's why it looked so odd. At any rate, I went with this conclusion and decided I might as well play it. After all, Sonic is a fictional character, and if Kyle really wanted to destroy him, he could have just snapped the disc in half, right? That would have taken no effort at all. So I went back inside, placed the CD into my computer, and sure enough, the file Sonic.exe was successfully installed. I ran an antivirus scan just to be safe, and everything appeared good to go. Upon starting the game, the typical Sonic 1 title screen greeted me. I felt a brief wave of nostalgia, but when I pressed the start button on my Steam controller, the screen flashed an alternate image for a split second before fading to black. There were several differences that I was able to pick out despite how quickly it faded away. The most obvious was that the water in the background turned blood red, and even looked a little more like blood than water. It's hard to explain without having seen it yourself. I also noticed that the big circle Sonic stands in appeared very rusty, and then Sonic himself had changed as well. His eyes were blackened, save for glowing red pupils. He looked almost like Metal Sonic, but his actual quills looked like his usual self. I may have missed a few other details for all I know. But the next screen was a dark save screen in the Sonic.EXE format, with a background of the sky from the Stardust Speedway Bad Future from Sonic CD. This was obviously a major departure from the typical Sonic 1, so perhaps that image was supposed to show up after all. After playing the full game, I'm quite certain it was. The save screen appeared to have 3 files already set up for me, but strangely 2 of them were locked. The first featured Tails, the second featured Knuckles, and the third, Dr. Robotnik. Seeing Dr. Robotnik actually made me quite excited to play this. I genuinely couldn't wait to see what playing as Dr. Robotnik would be like in this hack. Still, the fact that Sonic did not appear playable was puzzling, especially because the game was named after him. The next thing that I noticed was 3 rectangular static boxes hanging in the top half of each save file, which left me more confused than anything else. Maybe if I just play it, they'll eventually reveal my progress or something after I save and quit. And finally, the music. The save screen had a deep, ominous background track that I couldn't quite recognize, but the way it sounded, it may have been some horror game soundtrack in reverse? Interesting choice, I thought out loud. What was Kyle, or whoever made this game, trying to do by placing that track on the save screen? There was nothing else left to analyze, so I pressed start, which immediately froze the music track. Nothing happened for roughly 6 seconds, and I thought the game itself had frozen. But then I was startled when the game suddenly played a Kefka laugh from Final Fantasy VI. Another interesting choice, I muttered after the startle had worn off. Finally, the game was properly starting. The name of the first level was Hill Act 1, and sure enough, I was playing as Tails, the only character whose save file wasn't locked out. The music was strange, to say the least. Not scary, but not peaceful either. I don't really know how to describe it, honestly. But just like in the save screen, the melody of the song sounded like it was playing in reverse for some reason. I didn't know why this was a theme so far in the game, but I figured I'd just play along. Now, despite the level being named Hill, and indeed it used the Green Hill graphics, the stage was essentially completely flat. I had Tails running to the right for an inordinate amount of time, so long that I was about ready to just give up and take the disc out and break it in half like Kyle told me to. But right before I did, finally something showed up. I stopped, and it turned out that it was a dead animal. One of the animals that you normally free from a badnik after destroying it. I was actually less surprised by this dead animal than I was about Tails. He reacted to the sight. His face, which up until now was his normal Sonic 2 countenance, was now a frightened expression covered in sweat. As I continued to move right, more dead animals appeared, and the flowers in the background had apparently been ripped and or burned as well. Tails' expression turned more into sadness, as if this apparent massacre had broken his innocence. After all, he is one of the youngest Sonic characters. Out of morbid curiosity, I decided to move slowly and make frequent stops just to see how many different dead models there could be, and how many ways they could have been killed. Some lay in a pool of blood, others were missing a head, and probably the most disturbing was the squirrels who were hanged on a tree by their own entrails. These models were frequently copy-pasted, and the longer I went right, the more frequently they showed up. Until after about a minute of walking, there was a massive pile of them in a puddle of blood, each of their bodies incomplete, probably because some of their body parts had sunk to the bottom of the pile. It was at this point that I questioned the origin of this hack. I'd never known Kyle to have any sadistic tendencies, and I know he loved his dog. So for him to put all these dead animals in a Sonic hack, especially the hanged squirrels, would be exceptionally out of character for him. Perhaps one of his friends that I don't personally know made this, and he thought he'd pass this wacky game on to me as some kind of friendly prank? It certainly was interesting, to say the least. All the dead bodies have built into this crescendo of a pile on the ground, but once I passed that pile, the music stopped. I briefly turned back, testing if the music would come back, and it didn't. It was clear that this whole sequence was more or less an introduction to a major event that was about to happen. I continued walking right, and after another lengthy period of nothingness, though not as lengthy as before, a familiar figure showed up on the right side of the screen. "Ah, there he is," I said aloud. "Sonic." I still felt strange seeing Sonic as a non-playable character in a game called Sonic.EXE. At any rate, Tails' expression changed again, this time for the better, as he was happy to recognize his best friend after walking through the aftermath of that awful massacre. I tried to walk forward, but nothing happened at first. And then Tails walked forward on his own, so I figured this must have been a cutscene. But as he walked forward, two disturbing things occurred. First, Tails' face was changed back into a more worried, sweaty one again, and secondly, the screen was showing static while Tails walked closer. In fact, the static intensified both visually and audibly with each step he took. Sonic's eyes were closed the whole time, and he wasn't paying any attention to Tails. Until, when Tails was standing right next to him, his eyes suddenly opened before the screen cut out abruptly again. His eyes were black with red pupils, exactly like on the title screen, meaning I could no longer dismiss that as a glitch. Now, even though I knew this was just a game, my skin crawled a bit knowing that Sonic had been redesigned like this. There's something about turning a beloved, iconic protagonist into some kind of demonic-looking and ominous creature that resonates with me in the worst way. The screen stayed black for a few seconds, and then text showed up, thankfully staying long enough for me to actually read it. "Hello. Do you want to play with me?" "So, you've turned Sonic into Jigsaw, have you?" I mused. I really had to question the motive of somebody doing this to Sonic in a ROM hack, but whoever it was, it's their choice, and well, here I am playing the game. It seemed obvious that Sonic was also behind the massacre of the animals, but I figured, correctly as it turned out, that I would get no explanation from the game as to why he did that. The new level the game sent me to was called Hide and Seek. I raised my eyebrows at this, and when the screen came on, everything in the background was on fire, much like Angel Island early in Sonic 3. The level had such an innocuous title, but I wasn't falling for it for a second. Once again, I was startled by the face of Tails. Not by how he looked, but where he looked. He was looking straight into the camera, which I interpreted to be a breaking of the fourth wall, pleading the player to help him get out of wherever he'd fallen into. The music was familiar, and for once I actually recognized it. Ruin of Sadness from Klonoa 2. A fitting choice considering what Tails had just been through, and no doubt his situation isn't going to get better anytime soon. Despite supposedly being about a game of hide and seek, I was able to control Tails much the same as a typical classic Sonic level, so not sure what else to do, I kept running right, like I did on the stage proper. Once again, nothing happened for a long time. It seemed as if this game was testing my patience and curiosity at the same time, and it was explicit at this point that my reward for passing these tests wasn't going to be very pretty. But I pressed on, and there it was again, the Kefkalath, this time played over a series of flashing images of Sonic suspended over static again. By now I'd come to expect a star or two, so I was ready for something. Then Sonic, or at least this demonic version of him, appeared on the left side of the screen, floating ominously toward Tails. Yes, floating, despite not having golden hair or any sign of possessing the Chaos Emeralds. I knew I had to run as quickly as I could, but predictably, Tails couldn't outrun Sonic. However, his approach was slow enough for me to finally get my first good look at him. Not only were his eyes black with red pupils, but there were streaks of blood coming out of them. The expression on his face was just as demented. A smile stretching across most of his face as he approached Tails in some kind of manic joy. All the while, the drowning music was playing, letting me know, in case I somehow couldn't deduce it myself, that Tails' seconds were numbered. When Sonic finally touched Tails, I was expecting Tails to instantly die in a grotesque fashion like the other animals, but instead he broke down and sobbed profusely, again turned toward the camera. This was a simple process, but at the same time it was a lot to take in. I'm not going to lie, I was legitimately disturbed by what had just transpired, mostly because it was simply uncomfortable to watch a happy-go-lucky character like Tails become so tortured, especially by someone who's supposed to be his best friend. Now, of course, I knew that there's no way this would do anything to the actual Sonic canon, but it was uncomfortable all the same. It was impossible not to be saddened for Tails as he continued crying for almost 15 seconds. I thought for a bit that maybe the game was over or I needed to reset. But then Sonic, in this new demented form, reappeared, much larger than his normal self. He towered over Tails, who was now just looking at him in a defeated pose, as if to say, "Fine, you've got me. Now whatever it is you want to do, just do it already." And Sonic obliged. He lunged at Tails, a big splatter of blood plopped on the screen, and the screen cut to black while a loud, painful shriek of sound effect played. I couldn't help but notice that the sound wasn't bit crushed. It sounded like a real scream, not a 16-bit version of one. Once the shriek had finished, the Kefka laugh came back along with more text. "You're too slow. Want to try again?" I wasn't sure if this demonic Sonic, who I'm simply going to refer to as Sonic.EXE from now on because he's clearly not the regular Sonic we know and love, was talking to Tails or to me, the player. Now that I think about it, maybe that first text message was directed at me as well. At any rate, I was now booted back to the save screen, but now it was Knuckles' file who was open to be selected. Tails' sprite no longer existed in the main area of the save screen, but rather he now appeared in the spot that used to contain the TV static. Tails' fur had been turned to soot, no doubt burnt from the hide-and-seek level, and his eyes were shut and crying blood. His facial expression was the same defeated pose I saw moments before Sonic.EXE had struck him. I wasn't sure precisely how to interpret this. Was he dead? Beaten to an inch of his life and forced to suffer? Been turned into one of Sonic.EXE's puppets, hence the bleeding eyes? Or perhaps more than one of those choices? In any case, I could feel my skin crawling just looking at that image, so I decided to simply press start again to get away from the screen. My hope was that the much stronger Knuckles could at least fight back a little. It was clear to me that there was no way that I could win that Tails level. When I pressed start, the game did the same thing it did for me while selecting Tails. It froze for 6 seconds or so, and played the Kefka laugh. This level was called You Can't Run. I wasn't sure what the lack of apostrophe was supposed to signify, if anything, but regardless, the level loaded up with recognizable visuals. The ground was that of Scrap Brain Zone, and the sky was the same as the save screen, the Bad Future Stardust Speedway sky. This time the music was the Guy Guess battle from Earthbound. A cliche choice for sure, but its inclusion immediately sent me the message that things weren't about to get better anytime soon. At first, this level played out identically to Hill Act 1 in that the ground was totally flat and there didn't seem to be much to do. I braced myself for another annoyingly long corridor of nothingness, but something happened a bit quicker this time. Instead of dead animal piles, the entire screen turned into TV static. I stopped for a bit, but nothing seemed to have changed. I moved Knuckles a few more sprites to the right, and it happened again, with no apparent change once again. It happened twice more, before something finally did change. The scrap brain ground was now covered in blood splotches. I couldn't help but raise my eyebrows, since this blood was somewhat cartoonish in comparison to what I'd seen up to this point, and by now I'd seen so much blood that it really didn't mean much. However, I thought I saw Sonic.EXE's figure hovering close to Knuckles soon after the blood had shown up, which made me want to just help him run as far as I could, even if things were likely to end just as poorly as they did for Tails. It's worth noting that Knuckles was also reacting to everything that was going on, but to a lesser extent as Tails. His expressions were those of concern and being startled, rather than outright fear. This gave me some hope that maybe, indeed, Knuckles might be able to fight back. I kept him running constantly to the right, the blood splotches repeated, and he appeared again, in the same oversized form and pose as he did at the end of Hide and Seek. The screen buzzed with static again, for much longer this time, and when the static ended, I received more text, in broken but still legible font. Found you. This confused me somewhat, as Sonic.EXE had never set anything up with Knuckles about hide and seek, but something told me Sonic.EXE was operating by his own rules. There probably were none. The screen flashed static again, and when it came back, Knuckles was still alive, but Sonic.EXE was floating near him, surrounded by a gray, smoky haze. A high-pitched, unsettling mechanical whirring occurred in the background. The best way I can describe it is the sound of dentist tools mixed with an anguish yell of pain, if that makes any sense. At any rate, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to run from Sonic.EXE or try to fight, but I decided to stay true to my convictions and walked toward him. Sure enough, Knuckles attempted a punching animation, but before he could complete it, Sonic.EXE had teleported to the other side of the screen. I could already see where this was going, but I decided to go the distance. I had Knuckles try to chase Sonic.EXE, but sure enough, it was no use, as Sonic.EXE always managed to teleport away at the last second before Knuckles could connect a blow. After about 10 rounds of this, Knuckles finally gave up, broke down, and cried. Not as hysterically as Tails, but he clearly understood where this was going. Sure enough, Sonic.EXE stood behind Knuckles and stared at the sobbing Echidna with the same diabolical, satisfied grin for a couple seconds before he swooped in to kill Knuckles. The same blood splatter popped up, and the same realistic shriek occurred as the screen cut to black again. I wasn't quite as disturbed this time, as things had played out relatively similar to before, and these events were a bit shorter and more direct than what happened to Tails. But then Sonic.EXE spoke again via text on screen, and yet again the Kefka laugh. So many souls to play with, so little time. Wouldn't you agree? I was confused. Was I supposed to agree? I knew by now that the question was directed at me. I suppose, in a way, Sonic.EXE was playing with my soul by turning an entire franchise completely on its head and bulldozing everything in it, even though, again, every rational part of me knew that this should mean nothing to the franchise. I could kind of feel my soul being played with, or at least my head spinning a bit from all the wackiness. Nothing too dramatic, but certainly tangible. But I told myself to finish it out. After all, I cleared 2/3 of the game by now, so I was on the home stretch. I'd almost forgotten that Dr. Robotnik was the last character. While my first reaction to seeing him was excitement, I now felt overwhelming dread. If Sonic.EXE was capable of such remorseless slaughter of his best friends, what in God's name would he be willing to do to his lifelong enemy? Before I started, I took note of Knuckles, who, like Tails, was now inside the TV static, and also like Tails, his fur had darkened, his eyes were bleeding, and his expression was blank and defeated. I was struggling to think of what kind of person would be sadistic enough to make this hack, and why Kyle sent it to me. If Kyle was so disturbed by the game, he should have just snapped the CD, right? Was he not disturbed by it? Did he make it after all, despite how out of character it would be? Or was that letter he wrote, was he in actual danger? No, I refuse to accept it. It simply didn't make any sense. Nevertheless, by this point, the game had me legitimately thinking about it. I suppose that's a credit to the game. I finally stopped my own train of thought by pressing start, and, predictably, the Kefka laugh came after 6 seconds again. This level was just called ... just an ellipsis. The first thing I noticed, again, was Dr. Robotnik's facial expression. Like Tails, he was staring straight at the camera, and a large bead of sweat was on his face. I got the vibe that he didn't want to move forward, but subconsciously he also probably knew that standing still wouldn't do him any good either. I have to give credit to whoever the heck made this. The facial expressions were awfully expressive, especially for 16-bit characters. The second thing that I noticed was the graphics. The ground was a generic checkered floor, and the background was similar to Marble Zone in Sonic 1, but there were orange torches burning, and, surprise, blood splatters on the wall. Great, there's already blood in this one, I muttered. I was just about to take my first step, but then I noticed something about the background music. At first, I thought it was just a melancholy and somber piano piece, but it sounded slightly familiar, and then I placed it. It was Hill Act 1, but playing forwards instead of backwards. I wasn't sure if this was supposed to be symbolism of coming full circle. After all the same horrible things were happening over and over, it was hardly a circle of events. So I was finally done analyzing the environment and began to move Dr. Robotnik. I couldn't help but notice how much he outstretched his arms as he ran, as if silently pleading for some kind of help we all knew he probably wasn't going to get. I had almost forgotten that this running animation was actually in a regular Sonic game. It was his fleeing animation at the end of Sonic 2. I still want to think that little piece of symbolism is real, though. I was prepared for another flat level with some kind of twisted activity at the halfway point, but this time, after about 10 seconds of running, there was a downward staircase. Wow, is this actually an honest-to-God level? I pondered out loud. This was the first variation of flat terrain in the entire game thus far, and I was genuinely surprised to see something after so much flatness. But my question was quickly answered. Once Dr. Robotnik was down the last step, the background changed hues to be more reddish and the fires were now blue, with the blood splatters still very much intact despite blending in a little better with the background. I never did run into any enemies, or rings, or item boxes. All this led to was another empty hallway. At this point, my dread was beginning to give way to impatience. I just wanted my first full experience with this game to be over, and then I'd snap the disc in half the first chance I get. A second stairway then appeared, this one considerably longer than the first, but again, there were no eventful happenings until I reached the bottom again. The Kefka laugh came back yet again. By now I heard it so much that I basically had no reaction to it, but the background change this time added some extra zest to the laugh. The walls were now a dark maroon, barely visible, and the flames were a pure black. The blood splatters were never altered throughout the entire level. Dr. Robotnik's expression of unrest heightened as he and I sensed that his end was near. By now, I just wanted to get this over with, so I moved right constantly, bracing myself for whatever horror Sonic.EXE would perform on his old enemy. Eventually, he did show up in that same towering pose as the previous two levels, and the screen once again cut to static. But this static was much, much longer than any static before it. Yet again, I considered stopping, thinking the game had somehow messed itself up beyond repair. Or maybe this was meant to signify that Sonic.EXE himself had reached such an immense power level that it was difficult to express. While the static was buzzing, I felt equal parts dread and irritation. I was bracing myself for the sure-to-be gruesome finale, but I could also barely handle the illogicality of what I'd just played. Why even make a game where you literally have no chance of victory? What was the point? Yes, what I just played was a bit frightening, but once the player gets the gist of what's going on, they'll easily be able to see this stuff coming, so why even make a game like this? But finally, the static stopped, and the screen displayed a full-frame image that I don't think I can ever unsee. It was an extreme close-up of Sonic.EXE's face. The same black eyes and red pupils, the same blood dripping from them, and the same sadistic, diabolical grin which now revealed teeth which were yellow, but somehow it didn't seem like they were about to decay either. But what set this picture of Sonic.EXE apart from anything else I'd seen was the astounding realism. His quills looked remarkably lifelike, and the rest of his countenance was done in incredible detail. Overall, it gave me the feeling that I was genuinely being watched by something, as illogical as it may seem. Maybe seeing that awful image is a blessing in disguise. I'll never be able to unsee it, but maybe I'll see that horrible face when I'm, say, procrastinating the night before an exam, and I'll be extra motivated to study for the more important things that I need to do. But of course, at the time, all I could process was fear. I'd totally forgotten about Dr. Robotnik. I think Sonic.EXE had too. Sonic.EXE was targeting me now. And even though I knew he couldn't touch me from his game world, what he'd done would certainly leave a permanent mark on my psyche, in a sense, he really had won. And then, almost as if to rub it in, more text appeared over the image, written in realistic blood. I am God. And here is where I finally snapped. I talked to the diabolical hedgehog, inadvertently making his influence on me stronger by more or less acknowledging his existence. You? You aren't God. You don't even exist. You live inside a fake, hacked version of a video game from 1991. You really expect me to bow to you, commit my life and soul to you? Why would I do that when I could just break this disc in half and then nobody will ever see you again? What happened next sent a chill down my spine, the likes of which I haven't felt in years. Once I'd finished my indignant monologue, the static reappeared. One flash, two flashes, and then a very loud and horribly distorted version of the Kefka laugh played, as if Sonic.EXE had really heard me talk back to him and was mocking me for it. Looking back, of course, maybe he was supposed to do that regardless, but the timing of it spooked me to the core. I was convinced it was a true reaction. His lifelike appearance in the close-up helped me to heighten my irrational fear of that truly being the case. And then, one more full-screen static. This one the loudest and longest of them all. Once again, I consider this somewhat of a flexing of his growing power. Was the extra loudness meant to signify he'd gotten me too? Whatever the case, I sat frozen, staring at the static screen for a good 20 seconds or so. I was finally numb. I didn't attempt to take the game out of my computer during that 20 seconds. And because I didn't, I got to witness the most horrifying part of the game. Ready for round 2, Tom? My jaw dropped, and I could feel sweat pouring down my face. I don't know if I was just seeing things or what, but I've been processing the game in about as relaxed and logical a manner as I could muster. I really don't think my brain fabricated that text. Tom! Sonic.EXE called me by my first name. Now, of course, Tom is an awfully common name and will make a good wild guess for a stranger's name, but I couldn't have cared less about that. All I knew is he'd gotten it right. Thinking back, there's still logical explanations for it. In fact, the very first explanation was still very much valid. Maybe Kyle really did make it specifically for me. Or if one of Kyle's friends had made it, maybe Kyle just popped that in as a finishing touch when he sent the game to me. But at that precise moment, I lost interest in rationally explaining it. There were 3 possible ways I could experience this round 2 of which he spoke. 1, the game wasn't really over yet. Perhaps I'd be cut back to a new save stream with, say, Shadow or Amy or Espio. Or 2, there would be a sequel that Kyle or whoever sick psychopath he got to make this game would eventually make and send me in a similar fashion. Or 3, of course, round 2 would happen in real life at any moment. Sonic.EXE was beginning to manifest himself as a real entity in my mind, and my only safe course of action was to act like he really was real and rip that disc in half ASAP. Before I could, the text message had cut over to a game over screen which featured Sonic.EXE standing in a dark valley with the blood-soaked bodies of Tails, Knuckles, and Dr. Robotnik on the ground, all decapitated. Sonic.EXE himself was floating with the same satisfied smile on his face, though I was happy to see that he'd returned to being a little more pixelated. The music that played was a looped version of the US Sonic CD Game Over music in reverse again. I really don't understand why they kept doing that. But the fact that there was a Game Over screen told me that finally the experience was over and I was clear to do the deed. Except, of course, it couldn't be that easy. The CD slot of my computer refused to open. I rolled my eyes, muttering, "Of course!" But I could still feel my heart beating faster nonetheless. I kept at it, trying to be gentle enough not to damage my computer. After all, I knew I'd need it rigorously for the work I'd have to do in the fall, and I could barely afford to get a new one at this point. But all my efforts were totally fruitless. To my surprise, the static returned, and I was taken aback physically and mentally. Is Sonic.EXE going to respond to my efforts to get rid of the game? Is he about to taunt me again and proclaim his own divinity again? The answer was no, at least I think. The image now, which turned out to be the final image of the game, was of 2 glowing, blurred red eyes in the background, and I could also just make out Sonic.EXE's figure as well, with Japanese text superimposed over it. But what alarmed me was the sound. There were no instruments, only voices, and they all sounded like a group doing some kind of satanic chanting. I haven't the slightest clue where the hackers could have found a sound sample of that, but I felt like it was some kind of effort from the game's behalf to summon Sonic.EXE into the real world. Once again, their voices were completely realistic, with no sign of bit crushing whatsoever. Still, the CD compartment didn't open. I tried Control-Alt-Delete and Alt-F4, and neither of them worked either. I had no choice but to shut off my computer improperly. But when I tried to turn it back on, it refused! Barely holding back the urge to scream for help, I decided I had absolutely no choice. Whether the game killed my computer anyway, despite my computer claiming there wasn't a virus anywhere, or whether Sonic.exe was really in that disc somehow and was coming to get me, I decided I have to save myself, even if this danger doesn't likely exist. I told myself that next time I see Kyle, if I ever do, I'm forcing him to pay for a new computer. Because if it turns out he's fine, this is all his fault. So I broke into my computer. As I did, I felt a consistent warming in the room, whether it was coming from my sweating or simply the temporary mania I was experiencing, but in my heated state I could almost interpret it as Sonic.exe coming closer to me. My sense of urgency was higher than it had ever been in my life, but after no more than 2 minutes I was finally able to grab the CD and snap it in twain, to which I exhaled deeper than I'd ever done. I felt an incomparable relief. For all of 5 seconds, that is. A whisper sounded behind me, a very clear whisper, one that I don't think my brain could have made up. Ah, well done, Tom. I guess you win round 2 after all. I was half expecting it to be Kyle, but when I turned around I saw a Sonic.exe plush that wasn't in the room before. A plush doll? I had no idea what to interpret from this. Was it reduced to a doll because I'd snapped the disc? Did Kyle sneakily leave the doll in my bedroom and leave a clever voice recording waiting for me to lose my marbles? After all, I'd never looked over my shoulders the entire time. For the vast majority of my playthrough, I had no reason to, and after Sonic.exe proclaimed his divinity, I was too afraid to. I decided the best way to get to the bottom of this was to call Kyle. And as I did, I felt dumbfounded at myself that I hadn't thought to do this in the first place. What was I thinking? I could have just called him and told him I got this really weird note that claimed it was from him, and if he had picked up, it would have disproved everything from the start. At any rate, I can't change the past, so I was prepared to confront him over the phone. Of course, as I was expecting, it went to voicemail. I wanted to make sure to give him a piece of my mind, though, so I used a stern voice for my message. Hey man, I don't know what the heck you're doing right now, but I got this note in your handwriting about this freaking Sonic ROM hack called Sonic.exe, and I played it, and it was disturbing enough in its own right, but the game was impossible to exit, so my computer crashed, and I couldn't turn it back on, so the only way to get the disc out of there was to literally break open my computer. You owe me big time, dude. Also, I got this Sonic.exe doll in my room now, so if this was your idea of a prank, the jig's up. I'm done, alright? Later. I never heard back from Kyle the rest of that summer. When I got back into school, I tried asking people about him, but they didn't seem to know who he was, or at least didn't know what happened to him. I wish that were the only unsolved mystery. This Sonic.exe doll. I can't shake it. That whisper, it was just too realistic. Was that doll actually sentient before I broke the disc? Was it even a doll before that? Had I really avoided my own death that narrowly? I don't think I'll ever be able to completely get over it. To this day, I'm wondering how safe I actually am. I feel pretty safe. After all, the doll hasn't stunned or said anything since that day, but Kyle's complete absence has me eternally suspicious of it. To have broken the disc himself would have been a million times easier than writing me an entire paragraph of desperation on a sticky note. The more I dwell on it, the more confused I get. I've been trying to play the real Sonic games a lot more often nowadays in an attempt to wash the horror of Sonic.exe out of my consciousness, but I know deep down by now, it'll never completely vanish. He really did win round 1, whoever he may actually be, and I'll have to live knowing I can never take that away.